Wasabi guys, welcome back to another Commander Pickups video. It's a series where I recommend some cards for the Commander format that are relatively cheap. We're talking $5 and below if I can help it. This series is really intended for budget players who are looking to keep costs low when they're building one of their first decks, or just looking to build another deck to experiment with. I could be talking about cards that are $10, $20 that I personally think are good pickups, but I think the vast majority of people are looking for something that is a little bit more budget friendly. As always, if you have not, please do subscribe to the channel. I really do appreciate you guys showing up here, and I hope you enjoy the video. First, we have the artifact from Champions of Kamigawa, Honor-Worn Shaku. This is a 3-mana rock that can tap to add 1 colorless mana. There's a condition where you can tap an untapped legendary permanent you control to untap Honor-Worn Shaku. Now, I've talked about this before, really good in combination with the commander option King Makar. Any kind of commander where you're not dependent on that commander to deal commander damage, so you would need to have other ways of tapping it. This is a great way of doing that because you're also giving yourself mana production. It's very similar to the card Springleaf Drummond, where you're also tapping a creature for some mana of any color. I like Honor-Worn Shaku, and I like talking about it because it has not been reprinted for 17 years. And you know how it goes with these older sets. If we ever have a commander option where you need to have something like an Honor-Worn Shaku, the price of this uncommon could skyrocket. So I like recommending it. In worst case scenario, if it does get a reprint, you're not wasting that much money on it. Next up, we have Radiant Solar. I've talked about this card before. If you're a fan of the 2021 commander option Sephiroth, you'll know that venturing into the dungeon, while you can get that easily off of the trigger, you would only get it once per turn with that commander. And there were some other cards that offered you the ability to venture into the dungeon. However, none of them were quite as explosive as Radiant Solar. This 6-mana angel has a trigger where whenever it or another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you venture into the dungeon. So the fact that this does for that graveyard-focused deck meant that you can bring back creatures from your graveyard, get another venture into the dungeon trigger, synergize even further with Sephiroth so that you can keep bringing creatures back from your graveyard, and get even more of those triggers, making it pretty much easy to go your entire turn building your board presence, getting more value out of your dungeons. The reason why I'm talking about it is, of course, we will be returning to the Dungeons and Dragons theme. It's not a guarantee that we're going to see the return of Venture into the Dungeon, but I'd be willing to bet only a year later, Wizards of the Coast weren't going to go through the effort of creating these separate tokens representing each rooms of the dungeon if they were just going to abandon that idea altogether. What I'm thinking they could do is also offer brand new dungeons this time around. So with a ton of possibilities there, this being a pre-con card, it means that it has a lot of potential to go up in price. It's dirt cheap right now. Such a great card, incredibly underrated. Even if you're not playing a dungeon specific deck, the fact that this triggers for all of your non-token ETBs, it should make it worth putting in most ETB decks. Next up, we have Mirrormade from Throne of Eldraine. Now, permanent copy cards are a dime a dozen. They're usually for creatures, so whenever you get one for enchantments or artifacts, they tend to be a bit more significant. Since decks tend to play more creatures, you want to get more value out of the few enchantments you might be playing, or the few artifacts that you want to play that aren't just mana rocks. This makes Mirrormade pretty valuable, and the fact that it is only 3 mana to do this puts it in that sweet spot of mana that you're willing to pay to get another copy of an artifact or enchantment. But that's really it. It's not super complicated. I think it's a good value copy card. They're great in Commander. They've always been good in Commander. The vast majority you're going to see are creature only, so I think this is worth recommending for people who want to diversify their deck. And next up, we have Master Transmuter. If you're a fan of Shards of Alara, you're a fan of that whole block, you'll know that for a long time Master Transmuter was an expensive card. Has been reprinted though in Double Masters, and the format is maybe a little bit quicker than it used to be, so something like this isn't quite as overpowered as it used to be, but the ability is still strong, and the price that you're going to be paying for it, the cheapest one you're going to find is from the Archenemy deck, is pretty acceptable. You pay 1 blue, tap it to return an artifact you control to its owner's hand. You then may put an artifact card from your hand onto the battlefield. There are some pretty cool combos, and even if you're not comboing with Master Transmuter, I remember this being a fun way to abuse awesome ETBs like Sharum the Hegemon, back in the day where if you were playing artifacts in Esper, comboing was the law. It's been a long time, and while Master Transmuter isn't quite as feared as she used to be, I think it's still worth picking up considering we have a lot of focus on artifact decks If you're a fan of vehicles, we have a blue-white vehicle precon, and that's what these videos are meant for, low risk, high reward. I never guarantee that these cards are ever going to go up, just that you're not going to be losing much if you decide you want to invest in them. And next up, we have a card that I praised pretty highly. I did compare this to Disciple of Bolas because I think it has that same aristocrat impact, where instead of drawing cards, you're getting treasure tokens. And it's basically the 30-year-old debate of what do you prefer, getting more card draw or getting more mana. You know, to each their own. I think a lot of people are still going to want this for the treasure token synergy, so it's not just a discussion about mana versus card draw. There is a little bit more to consider here. The fact that you were also given this second ability, where you can sacrifice X artifacts to return target creature card power X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, means it's more than just simply a way of getting more mana. And it also synergizes even further with aristocrat decks, where you're going to be sacrificing a bunch of creatures anyway. It's a great card, it's incredibly cheap. Next up is a card from Amonkhet that I don't see a lot of people play, even though they absolutely should. It's Archfiend of Ifnir. Whenever you cycle or discard another card, you put a -1/-1 counter on each creature your opponents control. So right off the bat, if your deck is focused entirely around discarding a bunch of cards, your opponent's creatures are screwed. Even if you don't straight up kill creatures after discarding your hand to something like a Windfall or cycle a bunch of cards, you're still making them really tiny. It's not like other things that Black has to offer where it's -1/-1 until end of turn. As good as that is, it'll still deal with indestructible creatures. These will remain on the creatures, and depending on the type of creature, it could completely make it useless. So it hasn't been reprinted outside of Amonkhet, which is why I'm recommending it. I'm not going to recommend a card that you go pick up if it's been reprinted a dozen times. So this is not only a card I'm recommending you go pick up, but one that I believe everyone should be talking about a little bit more. And next up, we have a card that is incredible, but for some reason is still flying under the radar. I don't know why, but Harmonic Prodigy from Modern Horizons 2. This 2-mana human wizard has this ability. If an ability of a shaman or another wizard you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. How do I put this? This is insane. There are so many wizard commander options that would make this an auto-include, and I do see it in a lot of decks. I just don't know why it's so cheap. Let's just put it this way. If you're a fan of Nekasar the Mindraiser, old school commander option now, this will double the trigger, so each time an opponent would draw a card, they're getting dealt another damage. And I talked about Windfall with Archfiend of Ifnir. Can you imagine that? Each time you play a wheel spell, you're getting 7 cards, so that's 14 damage apiece. You like Niv Mizzet, that's another wizard commander option, very similar, dealing damage. Or Inala, a wizard tribal commander option. Not super familiar with shamans, but I'm sure there are a lot of good shaman synergies. Wizards are definitely powerful, they are a popular tribe that people return to. And then following that, we have maybe the most expensive card currently, Zorn, from Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. If you would create one or more treasure tokens, instead create those tokens plus an additional treasure token, it's no secret, we are going to be getting treasure tokens for pretty much every set. So having not a treasure token doubler, but one that will give you an additional treasure token each time you get one of these triggers is incredibly beneficial. It's around the $4 mark and it's going to keep going up, so I'm recommending it while it's still relatively cheap. It's really just a win more card that you can use to enhance those decks, make it a little bit easier to go off, but that's what a lot of commander players look for. They look for more of the same. They look for consistency. How can I make my deck work better? Great card. Definitely pick it up if you have not already. Second to last one for the video, we have Melstrom Pulse. This is another one. I talked about Master Transmuter being a way more expensive card back in the day. This is another example of a card that used to be way more expensive and also from around the Shards of Alara block. You destroy target non-land permanent and all other permanents with the same name as that permanent. In Commander, a format where it's singleton, you're not going to initially like this. However, I did just mention treasure tokens. Well, maybe treasure tokens aren't the best example because they could just sacrifice it in response. We do have a lot of other token strategies, and usually big token creatures, if they get multiples of those, this is a pretty easy way of dealing with it. Even if you're not going for the multi-hit, which I think might be a bit of a distraction, it's still a great card for 3 mana, you know, destroying a target non-land permanent. We also talked about copy permanents, so this also deals with Mirrormade if you have to deal with another artifact or an enchantment with the same name. Being pennies, I mean, it's a really cheap card now. I think is your cue to pick it up if you haven't. I know there's a lot of great removal in black and green to choose from, and it has shown its age, but I still think it's worth it for the money if you are looking to build a budget deck. Let's just put it this way, if you're drawing into a Melstrom Pulse and you need a problem solver, it's far from the last card you would want to see. And the last card to talk about, we mentioned Radiant Solar before, but I think Midnight Pathlighter is another great rare from the Precon deck that you should want to pick up. We are talking about preparation for the new Dungeons & Dragons theme set, and since it's going to have a commander focus, I have a pretty good feeling they're going to bring back Venture into the Dungeon, and this is another exceptional rare. Creatures you control can't be blocked except by legendary creatures, and whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you venture into the dungeon, which is a consistent way to continue getting Venture into the Dungeon triggers each turn, which is something that deck struggled to do without Sephras. But you have Midnight Pathlighter and you had Radiant Solar. I think both of these are quite explosive. If you get that deck going, it could be an absolute nightmare to have to stop, because you just have so many ways to keep your turn going. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think about it, and if you have any recommendations for the other commenters, please feel free to leave them below. It's all about sharing with the community great advice for the future of the Commander format. Subscribe if you have not already. Commander Void here. I will see you all next time.